Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Dr. Kenneth Wood from the University of St Andrews, and he's going to talk about UV lighting to prevent the airborne transmission of viruses. So I'm going to hand over straight away to you, Andy, and let you go.
Thank you, Paul. I hope you can see my screen okay.
I can see your screen and I can hear you.
Kenny Wood from St Andrews. Okay. Oh, thank you.
We're all set to go.
I'm giving this presentation on behalf of a very large team from a lot of universities throughout the UK and some companies and also colleagues in North America. So this team's been assembled over the last couple of years, really to investigate a new technology that I'm going to talk about, far ultraviolet C light. But to begin with, I want to just remind those of you that might not know of this about what UVC is in general and how it's been used for well over 100 years for disinfection of water surfaces and also for disinfection of air. So what's shown in this slide is the electromagnetic spectrum. We've got infrared light at long wavelengths going through the visible light. And then once you get bluer than blue, but it's been known for over 150 years that it has germicidal properties. And the mechanism of action, which is showing over on the right, it's believed that ultraviolet light is absorbed by DNA and RNA, it breaks bonds, and that then prevents the viruses or bacteria from replicating. It's been the go-to treatment for water purification for well over 100 years. Still, like I said, it's the go-to treatment for that. And it's been used for air disinfection since the 1930s. And I'm going to show some results of trials in the next slide. And the lights that are used have generally been mercury nanometers. And those wavelengths can penetrate into the skin and the eyes, and they can cause damage, not skin cancer, but they can cause a burning sensation like sunburn or photokeratitis, which is like a welder's flash for the eyes. So any deployment of UVC lights must be in either unoccupied rooms, and there's a couple of examples shown in the bottom of this slide where UV lights were used to cleanse the air and surfaces in the New York City subway trains, and also UV robots are often used in hospital wards to aid with cleaning there. But the UV must be in unoccupied spaces or deployed in such a way that the light cannot directly irradiate people. And this is where the so-called upper room devices come in, where a beam of ultraviolet light is emitted above head height and it's contagion of people in the room. It's been known that it's been effective for inactivating measles, tuberculosis, influenza. This has been well known since the 1930s, but it fell out of widespread use from the 1950s onwards. And this was due to the rise of antibiotics and vaccines. From the 1980s and onwards, there's been some renewed interest in using upper room UV for stopping the transmission of tuberculosis, and also with drug-resistant bacteria and the associated hospital-acquired infections or superbugs. With the current pandemic, there's been lots and lots of hype around UV. You may have received emails with all sorts of fantastic devices claiming to disinfect the air around you. What I'm going to show here is a picture from a Philadelphia school in the 1930s. The circled devices are upper room germicidal ultraviolet devices. And this is what I mentioned in the previous slide, where the light cannot shine directly onto the students in the room. So this trial from the 1930s, it was shown that it had a great effect on reducing the transmission and incidence of measles within classrooms where the UV light was deployed. There was subsequent trials occurred in London and upstate New York. They were not as successful, and in hindsight, it's because there was transmission happening outside of the classroom. So upper room or any ultraviolet light that's used for disinfection is going to be successful where it's treating the room where it is deployed. As soon as you move into other environments where GUV is not deployed, then transmission can occur. It just so happened that the Philadelphia schools where this trial from the 1930s was performed, the children were dropped off at the school and picked up by their parents. So there was not so much community transmission. So I guess in 2020 speak, you could say that they were in their own social bubbles. Other trials showed that it was effective at reducing the incidence of influenza in hospital wards, and it's been used for the reduction of tuberculosis transmission from the 1950s, and it's still used in the present day. A new technology that myself and other colleagues have become interested in, and I know that some of them are on this call. I see Ewan Eadie and Kath Noakes and also Nick Carslaw are on the call. They're all part of this team that are working together. We came to this as somewhat skeptical scientists wanting to really test some of the claims that were coming out about this new technology. And rather than the UVC being produced by mercury vapor lamps, it's produced by krypton chloride lamps. And they emit primarily at 222 nanometers. And the top right of this slide, you can see the spectrum from a krypton chloride lamp, and the y-axis is on a logarithmic scale. So each tick is a factor of 10 lower intensity. And on the x-axis, we can see the wavelengths. So the peak is about 220 nanometers, but you can see that there is also UVC light coming in at longer wavelengths. And those wavelengths need to be filtered so that the intensity of those wavelengths is decreased, so that we're removing the harmful light that can penetrate into the skin. Laboratory experiments show that this Far-UVC can inactivate viruses on surfaces and in air, and there's strong evidence that I'll briefly touch on that the Far-UVC cannot penetrate through the upper layers, the dead layers of the skin, can't get down to the living basal layers, and it can't penetrate through the tear layer of the eye. So its safety profile is much better than for the traditional mercury-based UVC lights. There's also negligible ozone production at these wavelengths. So the excitement was, could this be adopted then as a homegrown method for destroying pathogens or inactivating viruses in occupied indoor spaces? And as I said, us skeptical scientists, we wanted to know, is it safe and does it work? So I'll get straight on to some results. And we just received a notification from the journal that the paper presenting these results has just been accepted. We just got that letter this morning. And we have been collaborating with Kath Noakes and her team at the University of Leeds to trial some of the Far-UVC lights in their bioaerosol chamber. Now, the bioaerosol chamber, it's a room-sized environment, which is shown in this schematic here. It's about 4 by 3 by 2.5 meters or so. That's the dimensions of the room. We installed Far-UVC lights in the ceiling, and then we set the mechanical ventilation rate within the room to be 3 air changes per hour. And this is my colleague Ewan Eadie and myself doing some measurements of the light distribution with the room last summer. And what the experiment that we performed was, we did a range of experiments, but all of them ran for 3 hours. And we were continually introducing aerosolized bacteria into the room, Staph aureus in this case for this particular experiment. We introduced the aerosolized bacteria continually throughout the 3 hours of the experiment. So you can think of it as having a person standing, an infected person standing and coughing for 3 hours throughout this experiment. We allowed the first 2 hours, the lights were not on. So the concentration of airborne Staph aureus built up to a steady state within the room. And that's what can be seen here in these red and blue lines. And then when the lights were turned on, there was a sudden reduction, great reduction in the amount of concentration of Staph aureus in the air within the room. And we did it we performed the experiments for different intensities of the Far-UVC light for current exposure limits, or well, these were the limits that were current last summer. And then there's some new limits that have been introduced in the United States. And we also tried the lights at these new higher intensity limits. And what we found, remember that we were running the ventilation rate in the room in the bioaerosol chamber to be about 3 air changes per hour. The introduction of the Far-UVC lights meant that we had an equivalent air change rate of 35 air changes per hour for the current, which I guess is the UK and European limit, but it would go up to over 300 air changes per hour with the new limit. So this is not a decay experiment. I just want to emphasize that again, that we're looking at the continual introduction of pathogen and we're setting a new steady state because the UVC is inactivating the virus to this level. Portable air cleaners are typically about 15 air changes an hour, equivalent air changes an hour, so I've been told. And this was done for a bacteria, Staph aureus, and we know that coronaviruses and influenza are more susceptible to UVC, so we would expect further experiments to be performed even better for viruses. Just a quick thing on some computer simulations that we've been doing. The spaghetti-like plots that you see here are computer simulations for the airflow and then the inactivation of viruses within that are introduced into the room. So it starts off as being yellow, and then as the virus moves through the airflow and under the beam of the UV lights, it gets more and more inactivated, going to blue. And what we wanted to look at for this particular simulation was we just looked at a slice of the air within the room and looked at the destruction of or inactive slice, which is about 1.5 meters above the ground. And the two maps that we're seeing on the bottom right, the bottom left and right of this slide, are showing maps of the active virus at 1.5 meters above the floor. And our computer simulations are indicating that we could also achieve short range reduction of active virus from within a meter or so of where the pathogen was introduced. That research that I've just described, that was funded by the UK Health Security Agency, and we've been fortunate that we have recently received funding to do more trials at Leeds and more computer simulations from funding that we've received from NHS Scotland. We're planning to do different ventilation rates, look at different pathogens, and introducing furniture and heat sources. So trying, as Nick said in our first talk, trying to produce a more realistic environment rather than just the empty chamber pure experiment that we did. So that's the summary of that. We do believe this is a very effective technology. And I just want to show a couple of slides about skin safety that we've been working on. So this is my colleague, Ewan Eadie's forearm, and he irradiated that with light from a Far-UVC device to thousands of times the current safety limits that are applicable for that light. And on the right, we're looking at biopsies of Ewan's forearm, and the arrows are pointed to some DNA damage. And what you notice is that it's only happening just below the stratum corneum. So this is still in the dead layers of the skin that is going to about the layers of dye, and it's then going to be sloughed off and form dust that we find in our environments. The bottom right is a control experiment that we did where skin was irradiated by an ultraviolet B light. And you can see there that there's much more DNA damage throughout the skin down to the living cells. So again, this was further evidence that the upper layers of the skin are providing a protective layer against this particular wavelength of ultraviolet light. Now, it's not just our own group at Ninewells Hospital and in Scotland that have been working in skin and eye safety. There's been dozens of publications really been ramping up over the last couple of years, looking at the safety profile of the Far-UVC lights, and it is indeed indicating that it is a low-risk intervention. One possible deployment example, this is shown from a coffee shop in New York City, where the Far-UVC lights are integrated with normal lighting, and the little square that you can see in the middle here on the right, that's where the Far-UVC light is coming out, and then there's also optical lighting coming from beyond that. So I was told to keep these talks short. I could talk for hours about the work that we're doing, but that's really ending where that's ending what I've been wanted to tell you today. Just want to acknowledge our vast array of academic collaborators that we've assembled over the last couple of years. Thank you to the various research councils that have funded our research, but also I want to thank industry support, who have, many companies have loaned or gifted us Far-UVC lights that we could use in our experiments. So we want to thank them for supporting this independent research. I'll be happy to take any questions, and also Nick, Kath and Ewan are on the call, so they can perhaps answer any questions that may come as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Appreciate that, and it's very interesting work. Clearly, and it's good to see such a huge interdisciplinary team working on these issues. I think we have time for one quick question. Again, there's nothing in the chat, but if anyone would like to raise a question for Kenny, please do so now. Raise your hand or speak directly. We have one from Mariam Orm from the DFE. So Mariam, why don't you go ahead, please?
Thanks. Just a question about the skin safety. I'm very impressed with your colleague's dedication to science in irradiating his own arm. Is there any evidence looking at children's skin? I don't know of any reason to think that children's skin should be different, but if it's, I mean, I don't know much about children's skin, if it's any thinner or yeah, sorry, I'm rambling. Is there any evidence specifically on children's skin?
I think I can answer that. Hopefully I can answer that quite quickly, is that what is important here is the thickness of the stratum corneum, which is giving us the protective layer that's and its absorption of the ultraviolet light by proteins in that layer of the skin. And the thickness of that layer does not change with age. So a child's stratum corneum is the same thickness as an adult's or an old person's stratum corneum. And there's been research papers published on that. So it's really the thickness of the stratum corneum that's providing the protection.
Brilliant, thanks.
Okay, I think we need to move on, but thank you. There are a couple of questions for you in the chat, Kenny. Maybe you'd like to answer them in the chat. That would be very helpful.